We are so blessed to be able to have as your keynote today an incredible person. Dean Devlin is the president and founder of Electric Entertainment. He's obviously an accomplished screenwriter, producer, director, whose credits include the forthcoming sci-fi action picture Geostorm, as well as he's a longtime collaborator with Roland Emmerich on Universal Soldier, Stargate, Independence Day, Godzilla, The Patriot, and the highly anticipated sequel, Independence Day Resurgence. He's also had success in television with the Librarians and Leverage series, as well as the documentary Who Killed the Electric Car. He's going to be in a conversation this morning with Jevon Phillips from the Los Angeles Times. Jevon is now a producer for the LA Times website's entertainment section. He also contributes to the Times Hero Complex blog. He writes news and feature articles on genre shows and movies that have big followings. As Donald Trump would say, they are huge followings. So everybody, let's welcome Jevon and Dean. Please come on up.
This might be blocking this side of the room, but Hi.
Hello. Okay. All right. We're with Dean. We'll get this out of the way. I was asked to ask you this. Who's your favorite Beatle?
Paul.
That was pretty easy.
It's a tough call, but I'm with Paul.
Okay, we got that out of the way, just to let somebody know. So, as a writer and a producer, you get to oversee a project, literally from the idea to the screen to even post-production and everything. When you're writing and you know that you're producing, when does it hit you? Like, you write a line and it says, "Oh, there are 500 spacecraft descending from the bigger spacecraft." Do you actually look up while you're writing and say, wait, how are we going to do this in post? Does that ever cross paths?
When I started my career, I would be intimidated and say, well, can I write something that may be difficult to produce or whatever? But what's interesting, the more I've learned about our craft, very often the thing that sounds like the most crazy, hardest thing to do is fairly easy. And things that seem like, well, that's going to be much more practical are much more difficult. I'll give an example. On our TV series, we average over 100 effect shots per episode. And I'll never forget, very early on, the writers handed me this thing. It was a 5-page fight sequence. And it was like it was going to be 5 stuntmen plus our lead actors and then stunt doubles for them. And it was several pages of shooting. And I went to the writer's room and I said, why don't we just blow up the building? They go, well, we want to do something affordable. And I said, trust me, all these stunt guys fighting for 3 days, not affordable. Digitally blowing up a building, about 10 grand.
Wow. And yeah, when you throw in the fact that you're a director for your new film, for Geostorm, does that change at all the dynamic from words to screen?
Well, I think what's so exciting where we are today is that you don't have to limit your imagination. In other words, there's pretty much nothing you can imagine that can't be done. I mean, it comes to a matter of money sometimes and R&D, but I don't think you ever really have to limit it. And then when I think it gets really exciting is when you do have the limitations of money, is to say, all right, how can I still pull this off, but with existing resources and being clever and using filmmaking techniques?
And those filmmaking techniques often include visual effects in general. So can you talk a little bit about specific technologies or visual effects that you've used or that you're using now that kind of help you tell your story better?
Well, if you were to have asked me maybe 7 years ago, about digital effects versus, say, models. I would always say, well, models are going to be better for blowing things up or ripping things up or burning. But we've had so much advancements in fractal work, and digital fire, and digital water that really you can't make that as a hard-clad distinction on anything. I mean, on occasion a model will be better, but all the old rules are kind of out the door now. I'm always so surprised what we're able to pull off at a very high photoreal quality that we couldn't have done 7-10 years ago. The technology that we're pretty excited about on the film we're doing now is I had to do a lot of stuff with guys in spacesuits, and we didn't have the right kind of rigs to put the actors in spacesuits and make it look like they're weightless. So Jeff Oken came up with this idea of using 16 cameras to shoot the actor's head from all angles, and then digitally projecting that onto a model, and then sticking that into the suit. And it gave us such freedom that we could really animate any way we wanted. And I knew that the performance I had was going to work because we could change the head, we could add shadows, we could change the skin color. And it's worked out so much better than we had thought. Originally we thought, well, a waist-high shot or a far shot will work, but anything close wouldn't. But we're doing real extreme close-ups, and it's fantastic.
I know that later on there's going to be talk about virtual reality and things of that nature. Can you talk about how the relationship that you have specifically with how new technology is going to inform storytelling?
Well, I think, we've already seen this now trying to do films in 3D. It's not just like adding color to a movie. It's a whole new language. And I think the best 3D movies were the ones designed for the 3D experience to be the primary experience. Because you have to shoot it differently, you have to edit it differently. And I think VR is insanely exciting, but I think it's a completely different language, and we haven't developed it yet. And I think the people who start to develop that and really find out the ways to manipulate emotions and tell story, they're going to redefine it for us. But I don't think we're there yet. I think right now we're just kind of going, wow, this is really cool. What are we going to do with it? I likened it to, I think, just as an example of the different types of storytelling tools, for me, when I saw Avatar, there's this sequence where the soldiers are walking through this tunnel, and you're kind of walking with them, and you're going through you're going through this tunnel, and when you get to the end of the tunnel, just by that 3D experience, you feel like you're part of this group, and you relate to them, and you're bonded with them. Later, when I saw it in 2D, I didn't have that feeling, and they would have actually needed a storytelling device to give me that camaraderie. So I think, again, the more we learn where these tools create emotional connections to us, where we don't have to use older tools, then we'll adjust how we tell these stories. But I think we're just at the beginning.
Okay, well, we'll talk about, I guess we can't really talk too much about a story, but, a quote that I read from you said, "We resisted doing the sequel for years because we wanted to honor the first one." Now, this was specifically for Independence Day. You can't say much about the plot, we all kind of understand that, but technologically, is there much that you can talk about in terms of where you think you want the film to go? Is there a boundary that you have? And
well, I think that the breakthrough for Roland was when he did 2012, because he started to see that there were things he could do that he didn't know he could do. And he started to get very excited about those techniques, and I think he developed them a little bit further when he did Anonymous. So I think based on that, he got a lot of visual ideas, and so when we went to write this sequel, it was a little bit like the first movie. When we did the first film, I wasn't convinced about doing it. I thought, alien invasions had kind of been done better by other people. But when Roland turned to me and said, "Look out that window. Imagine a spaceship that's 14 miles wide. You can't even see the horizon." And I was like, okay, that's an image I haven't seen before. So when we went to do this one, he had a whole lot of that. We had a whole lot of ideas visually. And as we made the film, we relied fairly heavily on the NCAM to kind of see what we were shooting. And we had used it on the film I just shot before that on Geostorm to varying degrees of success. But I think the lessons we learned on that paid off for Independence Day. We were able to really be on the set and kind of see what our sets were going to look like, what a lot of the effects were going to look like. We had pre-done animation that we were able to see on the monitors while we were shooting. So I think Roland's imagination was excited by what could be done with visual effects, and then I think these tools allowed us to explain those visuals to our crew and our cast in a way that we couldn't before.
Okay. I had kind of the same type of question for Stargate. Now it's announced that they're going to be redoing the film in general. You guys got writers and everything like that. It was one of the first films to actually, I think it may have been the first film to have just a website, just in general have a website that people can get immersed in. And you know, how has storytelling online in general, you know, the Netflixes and everything like that, has that affected what you do and how you think about the projects that you want to do?
Well, to some degree, you think of the life of the film differently. You know, before we really only thought about the experience in the theater. That's the primary experience. That's the way you wanted people to judge your movie and feel about your film. But now you have to imagine its second life, its third life, its fourth life. And I think, you know, when we're talking about framing, when we're talking about digital effects, when we're talking about format, we're thinking about, well, how is this going to play later when it's living in home, you know, in a home situation, when it's on Netflix, when it's on, do we alter the cut? Do we alter the framing? Do we plan that in advance? You know, in the past, it was always just jerry-rig the movie to fit everywhere else. And I think now, because you really know that you're going to get a few weeks in a theater, and you're going to get years living digitally in other formats, I think you take it a lot more serious now.
Mm-hmm. And, well, I was going to talk more about the online thing, but we don't need that.
Well, I'll tell you, the story on Stargate was, it was a film that we had done independently. And at the time, it was funny, because when we were pitching it around, hey, how are you? When we were pitching it around, every studio head said to me, well, you know, science fiction is dead. And I was like, I didn't know it died. And so nobody would pick it up, so we financed the movie independently, and we had set it up at MGM for distribution after it was finished. And they really only bought it to plug a distribution hole. They didn't believe in the movie. They thought it was going to be a big bomb. And so this was in '94, and I remember saying to the studio, well, can I just have a couple parts of the marketing? They said, what parts do you want? And I said, I'd like to have all the sci-fi conventions. And they went, yours. And I said, and I'd like to have the internet. And they said, great, what's the internet? And so we actually created the first movie website for the film. Now, there'd been websites for movies before, but they were always fan-based. There'd never been like an official one done by the filmmakers in the studio. And that was the first one.
Wow. And now that's probably that's part of the thinking in terms of the marketing for any film, any big film, tentpole, or even small films. So I mentioned to you about working with Martin Scorsese a little bit in The Wannabe, which will be coming out sooner or later. When you have a filmmaker that is not as versed in, and I'm not saying this for Martin Scorsese, don't say that. But when you have a filmmaker that's not as versed in the whole technical aspects and the behind the scenes, the visual effects of it, does that affect how you as a producer work with them?
One of my favorite things in the world is to try and turn on a director to different things. And sometimes I'm successful, and sometimes they roll their eyes and walk out the door. But several times I've been able to convince directors who were anti-digital to shoot digital, or anti-effects to shoot effects. And usually we have a little shop here in Hollywood. And what I'll usually do is, if I'm going to go work with a director who doesn't have a lot of experience with that stuff, is I'll say, just spend a day at the shop. Because it's really like Santa's workshop. I mean, there's little elves behind every door doing cool things. And it's fun to watch them. It's fun to watch the light get turned on. I remember there's there was a TV series that Frank Darabont was going to do, or did do, and he was absolutely adamant on shooting Super 16 because he had done it years earlier on the Young Indiana Jones shows, and had great success with it, and he felt it was going to save them a lot of money. And I was saying to him, well, where are you going to get 16 millimeter film? Who's going to process it? It's probably going to be more expensive to do it. And he said, well, I don't like digital. I don't like the look of it. So I took him into our shop, and I walked him through the varying stages of how we deal with digital material. And he started to say things like, well, but what if I wanted it to look like Technicolor, Tricolor? I was like, boom. He goes, well, what if I wanted more grain? Boom. What if I wanted, and whatever he wanted, we very quickly showed it to him. And he got super, he ended up shooting the series at the Red Studios. Nice. It was fun to watch the lights turn on and him realizing what he could do. And it's the same with effects. There's very often times where people get nervous about effects or worry that effects are going to be more expensive than doing it the way they planned. And often I'm able to show them that that's not necessarily the case. You know, like on a television series where you have very little money, to blow up a car, a practical car, you've got to buy the car, you've got to gut the car, you got to get the fire department in, it's actually a fairly expensive thing. But to create a digital car, they all exist now. I mean, you guys know that. You can go online pretty much and buy a car that is almost photoreal, and then you have to just add a little love to it. And, well, again, as I said, what we can do with fractal work and fire, at least on our show, we found that we can digitally blow things up for much less money than doing it practically. And that bar of, well, practical always looks better, that's not necessarily the case anymore.
And you mentioned earlier that on the Librarians, I guess you're doing like 100 effect shots per episode. Now the difference, I mean, besides just the time that it takes to do them, the difference between television and film in general, what would you say is the difference, or is there really one nowadays?
Well, sure. I mean, there's a lot of difference. The amount of time and energy you can put into the shot, you know, you can't reach the level that we can do in features on television. That said, you can reach a much higher level than what we used to be able to do. But I think that the biggest difference is if you think of it like speed chess. You know, when you're doing a feature, you can kind of very slowly go through several stages of developing the effect shot, and several teams can work in different areas and slowly kind of come to a consensus of what's going to work. And when you're doing a television show, the artist has just got to take their best shot at it. You know, they got to just trust their instincts, make a move, and hope they got it right. And then, you know, if there's changes, there's very little time for changes. So it's speed chess.
Wow. I'll probably ask another question or two, and then if anybody has anything that they really want to ask Dean, right ahead. Now, well, I don't know if Geostorm, I can't talk about that. Can't talk about that. All right, how about this? Now, I know that you have, well, let's go back to Independence Day.
Sure.
You can't talk about plot, obviously, too much, but in terms of what it was that did put you over the top to say that you want to do the sequel, was it just, I mean, you mentioned what, you know, Roland was talking about in terms of writing and everything. Was it just, it's time? Was it?
No, I think that the main thing for us was that the first movie was really not modeled after alien movies. It was modeled after disaster movies from the 1970s, the Irwin Allen films. In other words, if you were to actually lay our film on top of, say, Towering Inferno, you would find enormous similarities of when characters show up, when plot changes happen. You know, it was much more about disaster movies than it was aliens. You know, we didn't personalize them. They were more like a force of nature. So if you think about it, there hasn't been that many disaster movies that had sequels that worked. And it's always a question of why would the same people be in another disaster? You know, these are the most unlucky humans ever. And for years, there was a lot of pressure on us to do a sequel, but it had never been thought of as a sequel. And then shortly after 9/11, I had an idea for a sequel that would be very different, and we talked to the studio about it. They actually wrote us a big fat check to write it. And when I finished the script, Roland and I looked at it, and we called the studio and said, we'd like to give you the money back. And they said, what? And we said, we don't want you to read the script. We don't want you to do this. We don't feel this is right. and we shouldn't get paid for it. And we literally sent the money back, and to the credit of the studio, they didn't just go hire someone else to go make a sequel. And then it was only, like I said, after Roland had done 2012 and he got inspired, he called me up and said, let's try one more time. Let's see if we can find something that's worth doing. And at that point, Roland and I hadn't worked together in over 12 years. And so I didn't know what it was going to be like for him and I to get in a room or whatever. And we took off to Palm Springs. We got into this room. We started writing. And it was like a time machine. It was like the day after we wrote the first movie. Things were clicking. Ideas started flowing. And by the end of those 4 days, we had come up with a concept that felt like, well, that's a worthy sequel. That doesn't feel like you're just trying to jam one. That feels like there's a reason to do the sequel, that it's organic. And then it actually got us thinking about how it could continue from there. And, then we went nuts. Then it became world building. And but yeah, so rather than wait to make a deal with the studio, we actually just went and spec'd the script, which is, normally spec'ing a script is fine because if they don't like it, someone else will like it. But when you spec a script that a studio owns, it's a bummer because if they don't like it, it's just dead. So we spec'd the script, and luckily they loved it, and we made a movie.
That's cool. Does anyone have any questions that they wanted to ask specifically? No? Then I'll continue. Oh, the mic is on that side. Oh, there's one.
What kind of effects
Hey, Randy.
what kind of effects did Roland find in 2012? What were the new technologies that you're talking about that he found and discovered?
Well, it wasn't even so much new technologies. It was just he was suddenly doing some very wide city shots that in the past he would have thought would look, that wouldn't look photoreal, and being able to have interactivity in much wider shots from higher angles, and being able to show larger vistas. In the past we would try to hide those things, with a lot of fog or rain at night or whatever. And suddenly he felt like, you can really do broad daylight shots that are quite wide and see a lot of interactivity with that and still stay completely photoreal. And so once he knew that, he started to say, well, what if, I can't tell you what he did, but he came up with some stuff that I thought was pretty cool and stuff that we haven't seen in other movies. And, Roland always starts visually. It's why our partnership, I think, worked real well for so long, is that for me, it always starts with the characters. For him, it starts with the images. And he came up with some images that were, I don't know if they're as compelling as the shadows that went over the city and the White House blowing up, but they were exciting enough for us to say, let's go make another movie.
Anyone else questions? No? There's one right there.
I was just interested with one of the hot topics today of being VR, that we're seeing. I think one of the most exciting parts of VR that we're seeing is associations with feature productions. That Crimson's Peak, The Walk, have all these VR experiences. I wanted to get your opinion on whether it's financially viable and also interesting creatively for a director to delve into these world buildings and this universe building in such a new way, and how that aligns. Do you think it's, as you did with the first website, something that we're going to see that every feature has a VR association?
I think we're starting to see some. We're talking about doing some on the films that I'm doing. I think the problem with it is that there's just not enough people who own VR headsets yet for it to be a financially viable model. But I think that's going to change in 2016. I think we're going to see the price is going to come down. I think a lot more people are going to buy it. And probably by 2017, I think there will be a viable financial model. I think right now it's more of a, how do we get ink? How do we get people talking about our stuff? And VR is so exciting that when people see it, then they want to talk about it. And so I think I think you're going to see a lot of links for promotion with VR right now, and that's why I think they're connected to big features. But again, as I think the language gets developed, I think it's going to change how we think about VR and what we could do. I didn't personally see this, but I was talking with some people who are very involved in VR the other day, and they told me about this one VR thing they had seen that seemed so interesting. And he said what the VR experience was is you put on these glasses, and you're sitting at a table with two other people on your side of the table. And on the other side of the table was a white racist and a black guy from the South. And they're screaming at each other. They're yelling terrible things at each other. And you're sitting on this side of the table. And You experience this for a few minutes. Then he said the lights went out, the lights went back up, and now you were the black guy on the other side of the table. And the words you heard were just slightly different. Just slightly different. Then the lights went out and you were the racist. And what you heard and what you said was slightly different. Then the lights went out and you were the guy sitting next to you in the first thing. And what they said the experience gave them was this thing of realizing that everybody experiences things differently. And he said that by the end of it, he had this feeling of empathy that he had never really experienced before. Now, again, I didn't see that myself, but the concept of that, of being able to use the visceral nature of virtual reality to let us connect and feel things in a way that's not just intellectual and not just done through juxtaposition of images, I think it's going to get really exciting. But again, as I said earlier, I don't think we've quite yet developed those tools, but as they develop, I think it'll go far beyond big budget action movies.
That's awesome.
Check. Working?
Yeah, I think so.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yep.
You know, you've been doing TV and film for a long time, and TV has it's kind of formed into a slightly different medium than it was like 10 years ago, right?
Not a doubt.
And this concept of binge watching on Netflix and so forth, does that sway you anyway creatively, knowing that it's being looked at in a slightly different way than it used to?
Yeah, I mean, I'm old. So when I was growing up, television was, you had 4 channels. And so you were fighting for a much bigger piece of the pie. And so television was incredibly formulaic and incredibly micromanaged because nobody wanted to alienate anybody and you wanted to get the biggest audience possible. And so the product tended to be much more predictable. And movies was where you got to do really exciting and interesting stuff because, it was the Wild West. Who knew what was going to work? And you did all this crazy stuff. Well, as time went on, movies became much more expensive to make and much more expensive to market. And then the pressures of not alienating people and speaking to a larger audience and the studio being at much greater risk on any individual picture, they became more micromanaged, they became more formulaic. Meanwhile, television exploded into 500 channels. So how do you get heard if you're one of 500 channels? Well, you take more risks and you do more edgy, interesting stuff. You don't try to speak to everyone, you try to speak to people who are gonna watch your channel. So suddenly, there was a huge paradigm shift of where you could do interesting work and where you could do what kind of work. And then, as you said, the advent of binge watching, well, that threw a challenge at us as storytellers, I think, because I was talking to people at Netflix and they said an interesting thing. They said, given any individual night, a viewer will choose an hour-long show over a 2-hour movie, almost every time. I mean, remarkable how many more times they would choose that. Yet, if they enjoy what they're watching, they'll put on the second episode. So they're still watching 2 hours. They just can't commit to it. And I think partially what that says is they're not sure it's going to be worth 2 hours of their time. So it puts a pressure on us as filmmakers to say, we got to hook you in earlier, we got to keep you engaged in a more intense way, or we're going to lose you. So yeah, I think it has affected the medium we want to work in, the way we tell the stories, the intensity of our hooks in those stories. So that was a long way of me saying yes. Sure.
I'm just curious if there are any other new tools on the market that you kind of want to get your hands on, or like hardware, maybe super, cameras that can look on total blackness, or drones, or anything like that.
We got to play with drones on the film I directed, and I have to tell you, I was so surprised how well it worked. Because on our TV series, we tried drones, and it was a disaster. They flew into trees. It was like horrible. But we needed to do a crane shot in Hong Kong, and we literally couldn't get the crane we wanted. And someone says, let's try it with a drone. And it was rock solid. I mean, it was amazing. And then so we said, well, if we can do that, what else can we do? And so we went crazy with that thing. Yeah, listen, I love toys. You know, I love any gizmo and gadgets, and I'm so excited about all the new things that come out, and you always want to play with them, whether it's the high-speed Phantom cameras and where they're going. And I'm a big Red guy, as maybe some of you know, and just playing with that level of resolution has been so much fun. The thing that I've been playing with the most, as I mentioned earlier, was the NCAM, and I really think that as a tool for me as a director on set, it's terrific. And if they can take it to the next level where it actually becomes usable information for digital effects, it'd be great. I mean, it's nice for eyeballing, you know, and I think it helps the effects artists kind of see what we were trying to do, but it's not a one-to-one. It doesn't give them tracking information that's usable or anything like that. I think when it does, it'll go, you know, it'll be used all the time. I mean, so those were the toys that I've been playing with lately, and of course, people keep telling me about cool new stuff, and I always want to play with it.
Hi there. This is from the immersive experiences table. So we have to ask, how do you think immersive experiences are changing storytelling?
Well, I think that that's part of what we were talking about before is how do you keep that viewer, the one that doesn't really want to commit to longer periods of time. So the more immersed they are, whether it's in the storytelling or the visual of it or the medium, you know, that's how we're gonna keep the audience. I mean, we're competing with a lot of things now. You know, we have a whole generation that's used to watching their entertainment on iPhones and laptops. So I think all the techniques that we have to develop if we want to continue in scripted entertainment is to use every technique possible to deepen that engagement. I hope that answers the question. I'm one of the few who doesn't. I think video games are awesome. I think movies are awesome. I don't think they're related. I mean, we've tried so many times, and so many great filmmakers have gotten involved, but they feel more like novelties. You know, I think a game experience is a different experience than a storytelling. I mean, again, maybe it's just because I'm old, but when I was growing up, I remember I had this uncle who knew nothing about the entertainment industry, and he knew I was in the industry, and he said to me, he said, "You know what your business really is?" And I said, "What?" And he goes, "They're bedtime stories." And I think he's right. You know, I think movies, television, they're wonderful bedtime stories, you know, and you want to sit back and have the story wash over you and drift away into it. I think the gaming experience is a much more involved experience. You're interacting with it, you're part of it. And again, so I think it's a different language. I think it's different tools. Do I think filmmakers could make a good video game? Sure. But I just don't think they link up naturally and organically. I think they're really totally different ways. You know, I think you can adapt one to the other in the same way you'd adapt a novel to a movie, but I don't see them marrying each other. And I've been proven wrong on other stuff too, so you can mark that one on the list.
Hi, Dean. What's your favorite project you worked on over the years?
Well, Jason. Jason and I, for the last 10 years, have been working on and off on this project called the Librarians. And for me, it's my favorite project. I like the project because, you know, we're doing a lot of stuff about superheroes, you know, over the last several years. And the superheroes of the Librarian have only one superpower. They're smart. You know, they didn't get bit by a spider. They didn't have a nuclear, they weren't exposed to nuclear materials. They just read a lot. They're just smart people. And the tone of the show is fun and light, and we have the best time making it. And we just get, hey, sorry. We just have a great time making that show. We did 3 movies over the course of, I guess it was 6 years, 5-6 years. And then the network asked for a series. And now we're doing the series. And it's just a blast. It's an absolute blast. And getting to work with you guys.
We got a couple minutes.
Earlier, we were talking, we mentioned an animation project that you have, and the difficulties of doing an indie animation project and the business model. Can you tell us more about that, how that works?
Well, the biggest problem in doing any kind of shows for a younger audience is the cost of marketing. There's an animated project that we've been trying to do for almost 10 years now, and we've gotten close several times, but the biggest problem becomes the marketing. You know, the outlets where you would have to promote your show know that you need them in a way that normal projects don't, and so the cost of advertising is nearly double. So if you're trying to do, you know, in our case, maybe a $15 to $20 million animated movie, you're still looking at close to 40 million in P&A domestically alone, and so it becomes really, really difficult, you know, on a math level to make that work.
Okay. Oh, are you waving? No, he's not waving. I guess one of the final things we talked. You were mentioning video games up here and how the entertainment experience is becoming more and more individualized. And I think video games is a great example of an individual experience. And you mentioned the VR, how people were sitting in different places and getting an individual experience of what was a group setting. Do you think at all that can movies give people an individual experience when they go in with one filmmaker kind of giving their vision out? And
well, I would argue your premise slightly, because I think that one of the things that's been happening through social media and in our video games is that it's becoming a new way for us to socialize. So I think that one of the things that used to really help us as people who wanted to make movies was we had the social experience. We had, you know, you wanted to be in a room with strangers and enjoy a laugh, you had to be in the movie theater. And there's a whole generation who feel like they are connected to their peers playing the video game or having a VR experience where someone else is wearing another headset in another part of the thing. So I think that the way in which we think about connecting with other humans during a piece of entertainment is altering. And I think we have to think about that in whatever we're doing, because we can't just simply rely on, we own the dark theater. You know, what that means is changing. You know, that there's a whole generation of people who feel like their experience is so good at home now with the beautiful 4K TV set they just bought with surround sound in their living room, that there's no need to get back to the theater. So, I mean, it's one of the many reasons why the people in this room are so important. Because one of the things that you can't experience in any other medium as well as you can in a movie theater is digital effects. You know, it's propping up the whole rest of the business. You know, people think that the mainstream action film is just because it's so commercial, but it's interesting. If you go back, I'm going 20 years back, but in '96, when Independence Day came out, it was also when Twister came out and the first Mission Impossible. But at the end of that year, all the newspapers called it the year of the independent movie. And I believe that when our films that are filled with beautiful special effects that drive people into the theater, it props up the entire theater business, because it reminds us why it's fun to be in a theater, why it's different, why that experience can't really be duplicated in the way that you experience it there anywhere else. And then you're watching a trailer for different kinds of films and maybe say, oh, I want to go see that now too. So I think that there's actually, aside from just making money for the studios, the art of digital effects is keeping the movie business alive right now.
And on that. Oh, well, actually, we were about to end, but I guess we can.
Sure.
Want to try one more?
Sure.
One more question.
Well, I actually had 3 questions, but they're all interwoven.
Fire away.
Sorry.
Fire away.
But you were just starting to talk about what I was going to ask you about, so it's a perfect segue. As a filmmaker, do you think the roles played by visual effects practitioners in pre-production shooting and post has evolved over the last 20 years?
Oh, great question.
And as a community, are we gaining any respect from producers and directors? And lastly, do you have any suggestions on things we could do to become more integrated into the filmmaking production process?
Two of those questions I feel like I can answer well. The third, I can't, and I'll explain. Yeah, a great question. I think, we used to always storyboard sequences in movies, and sometimes we did these animatics. But the whole art of pre-visualization has dramatically affected filmmaking. The way we shoot stuff, the way we produce the visual effects, to different, whether or not we're taking those assets from the pre-visualizations and then just growing them, or just using that to inspire us on what we're doing. The people from Third Floor are here, and I can tell you there's several sequences of the film I directed that they should get all the credit for, because I never would have thought of the stuff they came up with on those previses, and I went, I'm going to take credit for that. That's a great shot that I just came up with. And then, in post, the post visualization is enormously important, because we have to test our films and make really important decisions long before we can have those effects finished. So to be able to do post visualizations of sequences, which won't have the same visceral impact as the final, but at least intellectually the audience will know what's going on, and then you can make very important financial decisions and creative decisions about where you're going. So yes, I think the role of effects in pre and post is gigantically changed in the last several years. What was part two of your question again? I don't think there's a doubt about that. I think the biggest problem we have is the way in which filmmakers interact with effects people. And this is what I'm going to say is probably going to be controversial, and a lot of people disagree with me. But for me, I feel there are way too many layers in between the filmmaker and the effects artist. I got a couple people who agree. And I think the thing is, and I understand it, I guess, from a studio point of view, but most of the stuff I do is not with studios. Mostly we do stuff in-house. And I find that the more the individual artist can interact with the editor, the filmmaker, the DP, the better the experience is for everybody. And the less change orders and the less going down the wrong road. And when that happens, I think there is a lot more respect, because I've watched directors sit down next to a compositor and have their minds blown because they don't realize all the work that goes into it. I forget who said it, but someone was talking about dailies, with digital effects, and it's so different because you would never see a director looking at dailies of something he shot in Times Square and say, oh, we got to reshoot it. Those 4 extras back there, what are they doing? He wouldn't do it, and you wouldn't go and reshoot it. But you would ask an effects artist to completely redo a shot because that guy in the back, One of the things we've tried to institute on the last couple of things I've done that really have been helpful is that we don't look at digital effect shots without sound on it, because it changes where your eye goes and what your focus is and your priorities. But again, I think that the respect is absolutely growing because filmmakers can't do what they want to do without him. I mean, there's just no question. It's propping up the entire industry. I think, though, that respect would grow with closer interaction. And I would lobby for some of the walls being torn down. And your last question was about, I'm sorry. And that's the part where it's tough for me, because to some degree, my career, even though I'm doing mainstream stuff, I'm pretty removed from the industry. I kind of work in my own little bubble, with the exception of these 2 features I just did, which is the first time I've worked with studios in 12 years. I pretty much finance and make my own stuff, so I'm kind of out of the business, even though I'm functioning in it. So I'm not quite sure how to get that forward, although, again, I would say that when we look at the struggles that our effects companies are going through, that I think part of the solution of that is getting rid of enormous inefficiencies that have been hurting these effects houses. And I think, again, as those inefficiencies go away, there will be closer collaboration. And I think through that closer collaboration is where that respect will come, and where, frankly, I think effects artists will have more fun.
Well,
Who has to contribute at what point? How many people along the way have to make decisions before a filmmaker is seeing stuff? When decisions are made, how they're made. You'd have to go in specifics on individual projects, but I just think that there's so many levels that need to, in effect, cover their butt, that it's adding additional work and time that's unnecessary. And I think a very interesting thing was Gravity, where they had to commit to the previs for that workflow to work. And in traditional movies, no one wants to commit to any of those sequences until they've seen it and they've done a preview. And so these decisions are made so much later in the process. It's adding to how much overtime you're doing to get the shots out. You're racing to get stuff done at the end because we've just locked picture. But if we can start to commit to certain sequences, at least in previs, we can be working on that on a much more sane pace, sane hours, reducing the cost dramatically, and not making a whole lot of changes just because a lot of different people have to put their 2 cents in to justify their jobs.
okay. And that's, we'll end it on that right there.
Boy, am I going to get in trouble for that.
Talk with Dean Devlin here.